The first thing you'll need out is your economic engagement topicality example. There are a few parts of topicality. The first part is the definition. The second is the violation. The violation explains how the affirmative team does not meet the definition. The definition is always a term in the resolution. Then there are the standards part of a definition of a topicality, as well as the voter. So if you're negative and you're going to run a topicality, those are the four main sections that you need. Now we're going to go and look at the negative topicality notes. That's the 2-column notes on topicality that look like this. First thing, topicality is there to help assure that the affirmative meets the resolution. So they're falling under the topic of economic engagement toward Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela. Second thing that's very important for us to understand about topicality is that we only run topicality if we really think the other team isn't topical. If we really feel like they're not part of the resolution, we have to treat it as an a priori issue, which means it comes first. So that means I have to bring it up first in the 1NC. It has to be the first argument I run, before disad, before case arguments, period. So if you run topicality on the negative, it's the first thing you do in the 1NC. Also, it's based on plan text. So you can't run it because you hear something in solvency that doesn't sound topical or an inherency. You can only run it on the affirmative's plan text. So you have to make sure that their plan text isn't topical. For example, if their solvency talks about how they solve for terrorists, you can't say that they're not topical. You have to look to plan text only. We'll look at a few examples of some plan text here that would be untopical. So some plans that could be considered untopical. When you look at a plan, you need to, again, you're primarily looking at a mandate. So you can only run it off of what that plan text says. So for example, in a mandate to take Cuba off the terror watch list would perhaps be an untopical mandate. The word in the resolution it would violate would be economic engagement. Taking someone off the terror watch list isn't really an economic move, although there are probably economic repercussions to that. Another example would be legalized drugs in the United States. First of all, that violates the economic engagement part of the resolution. It also violates the part of the resolution that says that our increased economic engagement needs to be towards Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela, or toward Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela. Sorry, that should be toward, not towards. So again, you're looking only at plan, only at mandate, and then you're finding a word in the resolution that would seemingly violate. And then if you go back to your economic engagement example, your 2-column topicality notes, some guidelines for running topicality. First, don't run more than one topicality in a round. Second, don't run an abusive or unfair topicality. We want to be a team that runs topicality only when it needs to be run. Thirdly, don't run topicality if you don't think it really applies or if you think you're just going to drop it. So, next, onto parts of a topicality. You need to have a definition. The definition comes from the resolution. So it has to be a term in the resolution that the affirmative doesn't meet. And this is the first part of a topicality argument. This is the only part that needs a source. The rest is in your own words and explanations of standards. And typically the standards you can just copy and paste, but still, the definition is the only part that needs a source. Make sure you have an actual source. Dictionary.com is not a source of the definition. Tell me the dictionary that dictionary.com used. The right definition is key, and then the affirmative and negative will argue definitions. For sample topicality, we're not going to do the support good produce example that's in your notes. Instead, let's go ahead and flip to the economic engagement example that you have. And the definition that we used for that example is that economic engagement is the expansion of economic ties with an adversary. So this source isn't from a dictionary, it's from somebody in politics, which is okay. And they say that economic engagement is a policy of deliberately expanding economic ties with an adversary in order to have change in their behavior. So that would be an example of definition. After you go through the definition, you'll have to have the second part of a topicality, which is violation. So go back to your 2-column notes. The violation explains how the affirmative violates the definition, how they don't meet the definition of the word from the resolution. So the violation is very important. You need to be able to clearly explain how the affirmative doesn't meet the definition. The affirmative then will respond with an answer that we meet the definition. And we'll go over that when we get to affirmative answers. So for a violation on the economic engagement topicality, you would say that the affirmative plan does not, for example, with legalizing marijuana. So if this were run against a legalizing marijuana case, the affirmative plan legalizes a drug, which is not an increase in economic ties. Instead, it is a drug policy. An interesting, well, we'll come back to that actually. Another example would be taking Cuba off the terror watch list. You would say that the violation is that the affirmatives plan takes Cuba off the watch list, which is not increasing economic ties. Instead, it is a foreign policy move to improve relations. An interesting part of this definition is that it says you have to expand economic ties with an adversary. And this would allow tricky teams, or you could say clever teams, I suppose, to run an argument that would go like this. Because you have engagement with, for example, Mexico, you are outside of the resolution because you're not engaging with an adversary. This is an example of what I would consider an abusive topicality. You are not to do something like this, because the argument would say that economic engagement has to be with an adversary based on that definition, which might seem legitimate at first, but Mexico is a key component of the resolution, and that would completely disallow any case dealing with Mexico, which seems to be in direct violation with the resolution. But we do have to watch out for a team that might run something like that, which is why watching the second video is so important, which is how to answer topicality. So we can go through ways to answer an issue like that, especially if you're a Mexico case and somebody were to decide to do something like that. So again, violation explains how you violate the definition. Now we look to standards. Standards are the most important part of a topicality debate. It is what decides who wins topicality, actually. It tells the judge which definition to accept, because the negative should be presenting a definition and the affirmative should be presenting a different definition of the same term. You should have at least 3 standards when you do a negative topicality. And in order to think about standards in a better light, sometimes I like to think about, what makes a good banana. For example, some people's standard for a good banana is that it's brown and kind of mushy and really sweet. Other people like their bananas when they're almost crunchy, like cucumbers still, and really yellow. So whatever your standard is decides what's a good banana. Same with standards in a debate round. Whatever standard I picked helps me decide what's a good definition. There's a list of standards that you can pick from these notes. You can use these standards both affirmative and negative. The first standard we'll look at today is breadth versus depth, and please take notes on the side to help remember what these mean. But breadth versus depth basically means that a definition that limits the debate is better than one that expands the debate, because if we have fewer cases, a more narrow interpretation of the resolution, we have fewer cases to argue, which means we can talk more in depth about each one instead of talking about a lot of cases but not knowing very much about any of them. So a definition that would say economic engagement has to be with adversaries would narrow the topic more, providing for more depth, whereas economic engagement, being with anyone, offers a more broad interpretation. Another standard, we'll finish breadth versus depth first, I guess. So you're looking for, again, how the definition limits the resolution or expands the resolution. How many cases can you run under that definition? The next standard we're going to look at is bright line. So bright line standard says a definition that gives me a clear-cut idea of what is or is not topical is a better definition. For example, a definition that says 20% is what substantial means is a bright line. It gives you a clear-cut delineation between what's substantial and what's not substantial. And if you choose bright line as a standard, you would argue that the definition that provides the clearest definition, the clearest difference between what is and what is not topical, is the best definition. The third standard is framer's intent. Framer's intent is kind of hard to prove because it argues that the definition that fits with the folks that framed the resolution, the people that wrote the resolution, that whatever their intent was is the definition we should stick with. And sometimes that's hard to prove. Sometimes people will use information published from a journal that talks about what the people who wrote the resolution wanted us to debate about. But you could use this, for example, with the topicality, arguing that it has to be adversaries for economic engagement. If that's what the framers wanted us to talk about, they would not have included Mexico in the list of countries that we could address. So, framers' intent, again, just says that the definition that fits with what the folks who wrote the resolution wanted us to talk about is the definition we should stick with. And I would only use this standard if you can explain how the framers of the resolution clearly support or do not support the definition that you've picked for the word from the resolution. Next, we'll look at the standard of education. This standard is kind of a hard standard. It's broad, but it argues that the definition that provides for the most education is the best definition. So a definition that would allow us to engage in a more educational debate, both be prepared for the debate. So again, we're looking for a more narrow interpretation of what a word means. This pairs very well with limits or breadth versus depth. You can use this as a counter standard as well. When you're affirmative, you can say that the best education is actually having breadth, being able to talk about more issues and knowing more about a particular topic than knowing a lot about just a few parts of the topic. The next standard is fairness or ground, and this standard argues that we need a definition that's going to provide for enough affirmative cases that affirmative has choices but not so many that the negative gets overwhelmed with having to research too much. So equal ground for best. An definition that says substantial has to be 50% increase. Limits too much. It takes away too much affirmative ground because there's lots of things that you could do to change the system without being 50%. The next standard that we will address is tradition. And this works well if you have a definition that says something that we would most commonly accept as true. For example, instead of saying substantial is 50% or substantial is 20%, a traditional definition would just be that substantial is in the main or a large part. So a more general term, it's not as clear of a bright line. Grammatical context is the next standard we'll address. And grammatical context simply argues that we should define a word in a way that supports the way it's used in the resolution grammatically. So if it's used as an adjective, we should define it as an adjective. If it's used as a verb, we should define it as a verb. For example, economic engagement. Economic in this resolution is used to describe engagement. So a grammatical context standard would argue that the definition that uses economic as an adjective for engagement, or better yet, that would put economic engagement together and define it as one term, would be the better definition. Phrase is another standard that is similar to grammatical context. It essentially argues that we should be looking at a phrase as one term. So we should define a phrase together. So I wouldn't define federal and then government. Instead, I should define federal government together, because the United States federal government should substantially increase its economic engagement toward Cuba, Mexico, or Venezuela, expects us to use federal government together. Better yet, we should be using United States federal government as the term that we're defining as a whole, and not just federal government or not just United States. Our next standard is predictability. And predictability argues that the definition that provides for the most predictable interpretation or understanding of the term of the resolution is the best one, because that's the definition that most of us can understand and accept and prepare for. For example, economic engagement having to be with an adversary isn't really predictable. That's not what you would expect, because we economically engage with our allies and our enemies on a daily basis. In fact, economic engagement is a key part of a friendly relationship with another nation. So it wouldn't be a predictable definition to say that economic engagement has to happen with our adversaries. It would be more predictable to argue that it's with any other nation. Next, we'll look at field contextual or field expert. This standard says that a definition that comes from an expert in the field is a better definition than one that is just a general one. For example, economic engagement is engagement, increasing our economic trade or whatever with another country? The definition from the sample topicality comes from a professor of political science. So he's an expert in the field. That's field contextual. Legal definition is very similar to field contextual, except for instead of looking at an expert in the field, it argues that because we're debating something that Congress would be arguing as a bill, we should have a definition that comes from a legal dictionary, such as Words and Phrases or Black Law's Dictionary. Now, if you use legal, you need to make sure that your definition comes from a legal dictionary, and field contextual as well. Make sure that your definition comes from an expert in the field and not just a general dictionary. Common person is the opposite of a field contextual or legal standard. It argues that the best definition, instead of coming from a very specific source, comes from just a general dictionary like Webster's, because we're common people arguing the resolution. None of us are experts on the resolution or on legal matters, and the resolution is meant to be argued by common folk. So we should have a common definition that is easy to predict and easy to find. Every word has meaning. This is a standard that is the opposite of the phrase standard. It would argue that every word is put in the resolution for a particular purpose, and therefore each word should be defined on its own, and then it doesn't have to be defined as a phrase. So if somebody uses a standard as the phrase standard, and your affirmative, you could use a counter standard or a standard to argue against it, as every word has meaning. The next part of a topicality is the voting. Is the voters. The standards are the hardest part to understand. Voters are pretty simple. They give the judge a reason to vote on topicality. Why is it a voting issue? And a voting issue is something that says, if I win this issue, I win the round. So voters just explain why topicality is the most important voting issue. Typically, the affirmative doesn't argue against this. You need to have a voter on their reason to vote for topicality, but you can just copy them verbatim from these notes. So I'll just let you peruse them on your own. We don't need to cover them piece by piece right now like we did with standards. The last part of topicality that we're going to discuss is the types of topicality. The first type is non-topicality, which is what we just discussed. That's the most common, where you just say that the affirmative doesn't fit a word in the resolution. The next is effects topicality, and effects topicality argues that the affirmative eventually becomes topical, but it takes too many steps. For example, having diplomats created with Venezuela, so giving Venezuela a U.S. diplomat and U.S. a Venezuelan diplomat, might eventually lead to an economic discussion, yes, but there are too many steps involved. Extra topicality argues that part of the affirmative plan is topical. However, there is a part that isn't topical. or multiple parts. For example, there is a case being run this year on the novice level where they fully end the Cuban embargo, plus they take Cuba off the terror watch list. And taking Cuba off the terror watch list really is an economic engagement. It's an extra topical part of plan. And the way we deal with this is we don't say that the affirmative should be voted down. We just say that you should sever or cut off, take out any advantages related to the extra topical part. So the affirmative could still win the round, but they can't win any advantage related to taking Cuba off the terror watch list. The last is novice limits, and this just argues that they might be topical, but they are not one of the novice topic limits. You do not need to define a part or a term novice topic limits like that bottom part says, but you do need to list the novice topic limits.